funny story about that. We're here to discuss a research project called Finding the Way Home. This was a 2-year project involving young people aged 14 and 15 in Deptford and the Isle of Dogs, looking at their landscapes of safety and danger. We were interested in the places that they defined as safe or dangerous, the stories they told about those places, and what they associated with them. We spent a lot of time thinking about the kinds of research methods that would be appropriate to such a project, particularly the extent to which those methods would actively involve them in the issues that were being discussed and give them a sense of stake in those issues. Particularly important because we were dealing with very sensitive areas around race and public safety, in an area that in a lot of cases young people are portrayed in the media as being part of the problem, but not given much of an active walk-on role in defining the solutions.
This is a very interesting project. There are two main questions I want to ask you about in relation to it. One of them is how you choose methods to investigate landscapes of safety and danger. How do you find out about what young people have in their minds when they think about their, where they live and so on? And the second question is how far your objective of giving the young people a voice and a kind of stake in the proceedings helps or might possibly not help the aim of the research.
Well, we used a variety of methods. Some of them were more conventional kinds of open-ended interviews. There was some element of participant observation. But to that we added exercises that were more related to visual ethnography, using photography, using video, using artwork, because we thought that in using those kinds of media, it would enable particularly those young people who felt the interview situation was very difficult for them, particularly talking about sensitive issues, might feel kind of freer, might feel more enabled to kind of represent issues around landscapes of safety and danger using those media in the kind of more conventional ways. So we started the project with an exercise, a picture preference test that we called a fashion parade. And what we did was that we shot 50 images of youth styles, and the idea was that over those 50 images you ran through a whole gamut of possible styles linked to different kinds of issues, gender identifications, ethnic identifications, class identifications and so on. And what we did was simply ask the young people to choose the photographs that the one they liked the most, the one they liked the least, and then we asked them to give us a kind of an account as to why they'd made those choices.
So one of the reasons for choosing a method like that is simply because it is quite difficult to get the young people to talk directly about what you're interested in. So it's a way of getting them to say what they feel in a way that they feel more comfortable with. I suppose, and I understand that, I suppose one of the questions is what can you infer from these young people's preferences for fashion photographs? What does it actually tell you about the way that they feel about the world?
Right. Okay, well, I think one of the things interesting that came out, what we then did was having got this over the whole sample of 50 young people in Deptford, 50 young people in the Isle of Dogs, we then correlated their choices with issues to do with gender and ethnicity, and obviously compared the results in the two areas. Because one of the key aspects of this was to say, well, how did the patterns of identification of these young people vary between the two areas, given the very different histories of race relations in Deptford and the Isle of Dogs? And what we came up with, I think, was something quite interesting. I mean, it's a way of how you take something which in one way is seen as quite a qualitative sort of research method, but using quite large samples actually apply a quantitative kind of technique. So we use kind of an SPI, we produce pie charts showing the distribution of the choices and comparing it by gender, by ethnicity and by locality. And one of the things we found was that in the Isle of Dogs there was a marked preference amongst the young white people, boys and girls, for white identifications. In other words, they chose, I think one particular picture of a young white man wearing a football shirt, right, which we kind of dropped in there, and that was chosen, I mean, statistically, it was chosen far more than would be a random choice. And there are a number of other kinds of findings like that in relation to Deptford that we found in comparing, for example, the black boys and the black girls' choices were significantly different, holding ethnicity constant. So we began to unpick a pattern of identifications that I think it would have been difficult to get to simply by verbally asking people for their identifications. I think people would have had some kind of censoring would have come in there. But the very fact they were choosing, it was choosing an image, it was choosing a model, I think in a way enabled them to express those patterns of choice in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise done in, say, an interview situation.
Well, just to be clear that I've got it right, so you've got out of this, firstly, a pattern of ethnic identification, because it isn't just random. Secondly, the differences in the ethnic identifications of the young men and the young women, the boys and the girls. And thirdly, and perhaps the most interesting, the fact that the identifications of a similarly ethnically mixed group in one place are different from what they are in another. And that then becomes an index of the state of ethnic consciousness, as it were, in these two different places. And with that, I suppose that gives you a starting point to check to see whether, to look to see whether other measures of consciousness in Deptford and the Isle of Dogs corroborate or don't what you've got from your fashion measure.
That's exactly it in a nutshell. Now, the next exercise that we did involved constructing some specially posed photographs. The photographs showed a number of young people interacting in situations that were ambiguous, that it wasn't entirely clear when you looked at the photograph what was going on. So, for example, there's one photograph where there's a young woman is bending down the ground, picking up something from a bag, and there are two young men standing behind her, and one is leaning slightly forward. Now, obviously, that's a kind of image which could be read, interpreted in a number of different ways. I mean, one of them could be a bully, could just knock to the ground. The one leaning forward could actually be trying to be helpful and pick it up. It could have been an accident and so on. So all the photographs were deliberately constructed in this kind of ambiguous way. And what we asked the young people to do was to caption the photographs, to put dialogues, write in word bubbles, put in dialogues, and then put a caption in terms of what they thought was going on there. And again, that was in a sense the next step on, looking at, if you like, the kind of subject positions, asking them to kind of project themselves into a number of different kinds of subject positions, and to get from that their readings generally of the kinds of peer group relations, particularly this is focused on, again running through the variables of gender and ethnicity. The groups were differently composed, sometimes all one gender, sometimes mixed, sometimes all one ethnicity, sometimes mixed.
And what did you learn from that exercise?
What we learnt was that the kinds of the patterns of subject positions that were taken up again varied in both areas and also varied in terms of the gendering of them. We found that on the whole, in the Isle of Dogs sample, across the whole sample, there was a greater tendency to give the photographs a highly racialized reading, and also a reading that stressed the kind of element of negativity that could be in the situation, right? On the whole, looking at the whole sample as a whole, compared to those in Deptford. And that within the Isle of Dogs sample, again, there were significant differences between the white boys and the white girls, and between the white sample taken as a whole and the South Asian sample. Right? So, for example, we found the South Asian boys' kind of characterizations of these situations tended to see the South Asian figures in the photographs as potentially being kind of victimized, or potentially being vulnerable to kind of fairly negative kinds of interactions in the groups. Whereas the white boys, in a sense, did identify on the whole more with a kind of either a more positive reading of it, or a reading of it which stressed some kind of dissociation from potentially negative sort of understandings.
So these two measures begin to generate hypotheses that the boys and girls have a different frame of mind in relation to each other and these questions. That the different ethnic groups are different, and perhaps the most contentious or puzzling is that the same ethnic mix of young people in Deptford and the Isle of Dogs seem to see the world in different ways. Now, my question is, given these hypotheses, which are interesting ones, how far are you able to use your measures not simply to provide further evidence which might support these hypotheses, but to test these hypotheses. How rigorously do you, as it were, interrogate your evidence, examine your evidence to say, well, maybe this Deptford Isle of Dogs difference is an illusion. Maybe that isn't really the way it is. Maybe there are other factors that explain it.
Yes, well, clearly these different methods are ways of generating different levels of data and different levels of interpretation. And we deliberately devised a project that would enable us to correlate between, the data produced from one kind of method and that of another. So if we take the example of the photo storyboards, if we have some evidence there of that kind of patterning of subject position that comes out of that, we can then look at some of the later material that we get, for example, from the open-ended interviews, or from the audio diaries, or from the place mapping. I will describe these processes later. And to see to what extent there is a kind of a close fit or not. For example, if we go for some of the exercises, one in particular looked at much more the fantasy, landscapes. And then we compared that with the kinds of accounts that they gave through the audio diaries or through the interviews of their everyday social interactions, their everyday movements around the areas, the everyday sort of local situated knowledges of these particular places. Now, there's a third step on from that, which I think perhaps you're getting at in the question, which is that then how do you correlate that with other sorts of evidence, for example, evidence to do with levels of racial violence or patterns of racial harassment, or other kinds of indicators of safety and danger that might be in play.
No, well, my question wasn't, the issue wasn't so much about comparing these indicators with the real facts of racial violence. It was rather comparing these indicators with one another. You have a hypothesis that boys and girls and Deptford and Isle of Dogs young people see the world in racial ethnic terms in different ways, and you have quite a lot of different indicators which might be trying to explore the same kind of thing. And my question is simply, how far are you interested in where they contradict one another, and do they contradict one another, or are they telling the same story? The question of how this corresponds to the facts of racial violence in the area is another question which we might also want to look at, because I agree with you that all of these are measures of subjective states of mind or culture or whatever at this point. They're measures of how the kids see the world and experience the world. They're not measures of how many people get attacked.
So obviously, I mean, one of the things we are doing through having this multi-level approach to ethnography is to compare the story we get, if you like, from, say, the video walkabout, from the story we get from the interviews, from the stories we get from the fieldwork notes and the participant observation. And yeah, I mean, what we're concerned about is obviously to pick up the discrepancies, to pick up particular topics or particular frames of reference where there are marked discrepancies in the accounts being given by the same young people of similar or the same topics, but within a different kind of interpretive frame or maybe a different social context, and how that varies. So, for example, to take an obvious example, if you're doing an exercise that involves a group, there are dynamics going on in that group that may silence some of those young people, or that may get them to give a particular account of an issue or a place that is obviously, very aware of that this account is being listened to by other members of the group. And yet when you interview them individually, or if you go out in a different situation where they're feeling less under peer group pressure, they give a different kind of account. And that was in fact one of the key things that we picked up on, particularly comparing what was said or what was sayable in the school and what was said and what was sayable outside. And how that varied actually between the two schools. So we got a much greater discrepancy between the kinds of account of race and race relations we got within school on the Isle of Dogs compared with the accounts we got when we took them out on these video walkabouts. A very, very different kind of story. Whereas in Deptford, there was much less of a discrepancy between the two accounts. So once we pick up on that, we then say, well, now what does that tell us about the culture of the school, about the kind of ethos in the school around how issues of race are discussed? And then we can then check that out by interviewing the teachers or observing what goes on in the schools.
So why is it that the young people are so much more consistent, as it were, in the different settings in Deptford than they are in the Isle of Dogs? How do you explain this very interesting difference?
How we explained it was through additional work we did with the teachers and with some of the young people. It was clear that in the Isle of Dogs, the school was, first of all, in a much more front-line situation as regards race. I mean, that there was a considerable element of kind of racial violence in the school itself, in and around the school. The immediate environment around the school was defined as a dangerous place by a very large number of the young people. This didn't apply in the Deptford school at all. Secondly, and partly as perhaps a function of that, the school in the Isle of Dogs had a very kind of like strict anti-racist policy designed to kind of clamp down, obviously, on all that. And of course, that meant that there wasn't the kind of framework in which these issues could be kind of openly discussed. So basically, they weren't openly discussed. And then, of course, once the young people, so once they were being interviewed in the school situation, it was very hard to get any of the young people, white or Asian, to talk about those sorts of issues. This then put pressure on some of the field workers, actually, who felt that they weren't able to kind of engage with the young people around that issue. But once we went outside the school, in a number of exercises, then it was a very different story. In Deptford, the same thing didn't apply, although there was a different factor there. The school had a very strong racial harmony discourse. The idea that, black and white are all part of the same society, they're all living together, there has to be justice and equality and so on. And there what happened was that official racial harmony discourse did, we felt, inhibit some of the young people in exploring aspects of difference. They tended to downplay that. Now I think that's an example of how you can look at the kinds of evidence, the patterns of identification and so on that you're getting from some of the exercises we've described, and then look at that in this wider context of actually what is the school culture, what is the school policy, how that relates to the place of the school in local community relations in the two areas. And so it's an example of how you can compare the different kinds of research data and, in a sense, get a kind of story out of it.
There are, in fact, however, two different explanations that you've suggested. One of them is that the children mind their P's and Q's in one place because they have to, because the school demands that they do, and in the other they're freer. But the other is that in one environment it really is more full of conflict and tension than it is in the other. Now, how does one distinguish the weight of the more racialised and conflictual environment in the Isle of Dogs compared with Deptford from the fact that the school in the Isle of Dogs is more repressive than the school in Deptford? How do you distinguish these two different kinds of explanation?
Well, I think it wouldn't be right to give the impression that real race relations on the ground in Deptford are any less complex and conflicted. They are, but they're perhaps, at least at the present time, less visibly and in terms of media representations, less kind of flagged up as being kind of front line of kind of racial violence. Although if you actually think, of course, in terms of Deptford and the Stephen Lawrence case and so on, I mean, you're talking about an area which has, and this is why we chose the two areas, both areas have long histories of racial violence, intervention by racialist organisations and so on, right? But what we wanted to look at was very much the sense that young people had of that history, whether indeed they had a sense of the history at all, actually, but certainly how they positioned themselves within it, and I think that's what we were looking for.
Well, now, hearing about these two first methods you use raises a question for me about how you're accumulating data and what you're doing with it. And let me put two possibilities. One is that you start out with a kind of hypothesis, and you have lots of different ways of testing this hypothesis, essentially a hypothesis about differences between two kinds of areas or boys and girls or what have you. And a second possibility, which I think is probably what you're actually doing, is that you're using these methods not so much to test a hypothesis that you already have, but to try to explore in different dimensions and with more depth what might be going on. In other words, to construct a more and more elaborated hypothesis. What Glaser and Strauss talk about as grounded theory, that you have qualitative data and you find some concepts or ideas in it and you go back to more data and you elaborate and fill out this hypothesis until you finish up with a body of ideas which is supported by a whole lot of data. And the benefit of these different kinds of measure isn't then simply that they're testing the same thing in different ways, but they're enabling you to develop a more complex set of models or ideas. I wonder whether you might like to say something about how you are, in fact, using this set of measures, and I suppose how far also you are using them in a definite sequence. Or
well, we certainly didn't start out with, if you like, a hard hypothesis. You know, if conditions A, B, and C apply, then we would expect patterns X, Y, and Z to obtain. We didn't have that kind of hard hypothesis. We did have a number of kind of concepts that we used to kind of map a kind of agenda of research issues. And one of those key concepts was the distinction between protocols of public propriety, which in this account is seen to be something, a sort of a kind of a mapping of issues of safety and danger, which is very much involving women and adults, and comparing that with rules of territoriality, which young people are much more sort of positioned within. So we sort of said that there might be these two kind of basic kind of frames of reference that might apply, and we wanted to see whether, in fact, that gender difference, for example, did apply, whether girls would more likely use a language of public propriety to define their stake in the areas of what was safe and dangerous compared to boys, and whether boys were had a much more territorialised view. And actually, I think we discovered that actually there wasn't a neat gender split like that, that some of the girls had their own sense of territory, but very interestingly, one of the examples, that sense of territory was actually located in a public library, which would be a sort of place of public propriety from an adult point of view, but was being reconfigured. So, in other words, we did have concepts that we applied in the sense, see to what extent they, as ideal typical constructs, they would actually be empirically there. But I think your point about grounded theory is right, that in a sense, what we wanted to do was provide a series of step-by-step exercises, and the sequential nature of them was quite important. We saw them really as separate kind of chapters in a story. So they were quite short exercises. They didn't take very long to do, which is important for children of this age. They took about 20 minutes to do on the whole, although some of them were a bit longer. Some of them were homework exercises or things they did over the weekends. But on the whole, they were kind of fairly short and very quite well framed kind of exercises, but to see them as a step-by-step exploration. And as we went, then the idea was precisely, as you said, to build up kind of layers of evidence, and as you sifted through the evidence, as you compared the material, the data produced by the different kinds of exercises, to produce a more grounded theory, a more, if you like, differentiated mapping of race, place and identity than had been generated by previous accounts that tended to be rather like top-down views, rather kind of functionalist kind of accounts, which kind of read off the story, really, if you like, from a rather kind of macro kind of perspective. So we wanted much more micro, much more local situated knowledge to kind of come through, to kind of complicate that kind of story.
Well, I'd like you to clarify, if you would, the point of these concepts of territoriality and public propriety as applied to boys and girls in codings of place. I understand territoriality better because it's a familiar way of describing adolescent boys and their gang formations and so on and so forth, racial or otherwise. What do you mean, though, by public propriety, and why does that characterise the way girls see the world, or why did you think it did?
Well, by public propriety, I mean language which very much stresses the sense of a way of owning public space, which defines some people as being legitimately, having legitimate claims on that space, on the resources that are in that space. They have a kind of, like, a legal entitlement or a historical entitlement, if you like. But that is very much argued through discourses to do with the state, to do with civility, to do with those who are respectable enough in the area to substantiate those claims, right? And in a way, it does the same thing as territoriality, but at a different level, using different discourses, different kinds of constructs. And at least historically, those sorts of protocols of public propriety have been associated more with women's role in the community, with notions of the way women operate in working class communities and define certain stakes in those communities, the way the more skilled workers have operated, operating much more through institutions, through organisations, not through street gangs and informal kind of peer groups. So that's the distinction.
When one looks at this range of methods, you describe them as providing rather kind of brief snapshots into a way in which the young people see the world, rather than attempting to get a rounded, full picture of the way any particular young person sees the world. And I'm wondering, why the idea of a more in-depth biographical approach to these young people wasn't chosen, or indeed whether it would have been helpful to have chosen it, because it seems to me you have a series of, not exactly attitudes, but a series of perspectives of the young people measured by photographs, storyboards, and so on and so forth, walkabouts. But as for how the child or the young person sees the world as a whole, and how they would describe the reasons why they see the world, it seems to me slightly escapes your method. I mean, is that true, or?
One of the problems we had in setting up interviews with young people, because there were interviews at the very beginning, which was very introductory, just basically establishing a basic rapport between the young field workers we had and the young people. And there was a closure interview, which was an open-ended interview that lasted about an hour, and really did sort of revisit all the exercises we'd done and all the issues and themes and topics that had been worked through, and indeed did ask for a first-person account. And we actually narrowed the sample size down for that purpose to 10 in each sample, and we actually chose the 10 that we thought were the most interesting from, if you like, from a sociological point of view, and also, frankly, actually would also give an interesting account of their experience of being involved in the research. Now, these what we call closure interviews produced, certainly did produce biographical accounts or biographized accounts. In other words, young people used the opportunity in some cases to take their own kind of line of thought for a walk through the research agenda, and did tell quite a number of stories which they hadn't been able to or felt free to communicate in any of the other exercises. The other exercises, almost by definition, were either done in school or in small groups. Now, one of the constraints we had in one of the schools, in the Isle of Dogs, school in the Isle of Dogs, was that the school did not allow us to interview the young people on a one-to-one basis. And this was because of the whole kind of... there was no adult, there was a rule in the school that no adult was allowed to be on their own with a young person in a room. There always had to be somebody else present. And this kind of stacked up with the whole kind of siege mentality, in a way, of this school. It wasn't just about race, it was about issues to do with sexuality and all the kind of moral panic around child abuse. So the whole issue of safety and danger was very sexualized as well as racialized in the school. So that meant that we couldn't have these one-to-one interviews. There always had to be another interview going on in the room at the same time. And this actually was a major problem, actually, for the field work.
Can I ask, how far did the interviews, the closure interviews you did, focus on your specific agenda of where the kids felt safe and where they didn't? And how far were they more open-ended explorations of how the kids saw themselves and their lives?
Yes, in the closure interviews, we did go over the ground, did look again at the material they produced around safety and danger, their sense of spaces of possible adventure, the notions of precaution and all of that. But the idea of the closure interview was precisely to give them a space where they could bring out issues or topics that they felt they hadn't been able to talk about before. And we were aware all the time that it was important to keep that kind of openness there, in a way. Although in both schools and in both areas, of course, issues of race were so kind of massively present in their everyday lives and in their consciousness, so that the issue was, in what context and within what frame could those issues be talked about and kind of worked through? And that was the thing that many of the young people did pick up on. They found that the research program provided them with a context and with a frame in which they could address those issues in a way that they hadn't been able to do otherwise in school.
Well, we'll discuss discuss the question of what the young people get out of this whole process, which I agree is very interesting in a minute. But before that, there is the question of how far the interviews and the other measures do, to some extent, distort the reality or have the potential for distorting the reality by pressing the kids to account for attitudes to questions that they might not in other circumstances regard as important as the researchers do. If you ask people questions about race and safety and danger, they will talk about race and safety and danger, even if they never talk about it or hardly think about it. So one of the arguments against any kind of structured interview process is that it, so to speak, structures the way of thinking of the subject and doesn't tell you about the actual way of thinking of the subject. And I suppose my question is, how far were you able to ensure that the information you were getting from these kids was a reflection of the way they thought about the world in everyday terms and wasn't simply the story they told when asked to have a story, you know, in relation to the research topic?
Well, the closure interview was deliberately kind of open-ended. It started by asking them really for their comments, reflections or evaluation of the project and what had they got out of it, what had they thought it had been about, and so on. Of course, the thing is that any research project like this is very socially embedded. It's embedded in a school, it's embedded in a particular locality, it's embedded in a particular conjuncture, and we chose these two areas because issues of race and ethnicity were very embedded, right? I mean, so they were there, if you like. So the issue then becomes, given the fact that they're there, they're part of the kind of common sense discourse, they're part of the kind of currency of talk and action in those areas. How do young people within these particular research frames deal with them, right? Now, in one of the schools, for example, there was a real problem with the way the research project was positioned, because this school, the Isle of Dogs school, had an anti-bullying week, and the head of the school made it very clear that she wanted our researchers to play a role in this anti-bullying week. And partly as a way of buying ourselves into the kind of good books of the school, because it was quite difficult to actually get the school to agree to this whole project, because it was dealing with such a sensitive area. Anyway, we decided that we would take part in this, that we would set up some discussion groups and so on. Now, I'm not sure that was the right thing to have done, but nevertheless, the effect was to position our field workers very closely to the kind of school's official line on all of this. And it took quite a considerable time after that to establish a kind of distance and a difference between what we were doing and what the school was doing. So, I mean, that's an example, I think, of where the issues are actually not as clear-cut as I think your question suggests. In other words, you can't sort of bracket out a sort of level, but there is the kind of real sets of social relations in which and there is the kind of research frame. The research itself became socially embedded in a context which was highly racialized, in which these issues around where was safe and where was dangerous, who was safe and who was dangerous, were absolutely in play.
Well, the reason I'm interested in how your interviews and other methods structure the responses of the young people is because of a question I have about what you say about the intensity of racialization in this community. Because it seems to me that if you ask them questions about, you know, is this an area that belongs to Bangladeshis or white people, and do they feel safe or dangerous, they'll say something because they're being asked a question and the question has some kind of sense. But what that won't necessarily tell you is how really important that is to them. And it seems to me you only find out about how really important something is to somebody when you give them the opportunity to establish its importance, when you don't more or less tell them it's important because you ask them the question and continue to ask them the questions about that particular topic. And the thing I'm uncertain about in your work is how far you've demonstrated the intensity of racialization and territorialization in the research. You've demonstrated that it exists, but how important it is a question. Now, one of the reasons I came to feel that is watching your film, because what I was struck by watching your film was how comfortable these young people seemed to be with each other and, in a way, with the things that you were talking about, even when, as often was the case, they were in mixed groups. So they were being asked about all these kind of questions, but there was a white boy with these girls and so on, these black girls and so on. Didn't seem to make any difference. So one way of reading the film was to say, well, this is a surprisingly kind of amicable environment. It works surprisingly well. Now, you might say, well, this is because of the project. The project is helping them to digest these questions, and that might be true as well. But I think it's a real question about how you measure the intensity of difficulty that, race is producing in this environment.
Well, the piece of work you're referring to is the video walkabouts we organised. And as I said earlier, this was one of the contexts in which young people came out of school. We did the exercise like this, that we formed the groups in ways that some of them were mixed ethnic groups, mixed gender groups, and some weren't. We had a group where we brought together people we thought had a very kind of, if you like, rather paranoid view of the kind of the local area and its dangers, and another group had a much more relaxed view. I'm not sure exactly which group that you're referring to. It might be that it was one of the groups that, in any case, had a more kind of relaxed reading of kind of relations in the area. But in general terms, in both areas, comparing both areas, this video walkabout did seem to provide a frame in which young people felt quite comfortable to kind of talk about. As they walked around, they told stories about things that had happened to them or their friends in the area, or things to do with the police or the adults or whatever. And it acted as a very important kind of elicitor of stories, really, which, since narrative landscape was what it was all about, was kind of successful. Now, as regards the issue of the kind of intensity of it all, I think this is where having a kind of multi-level approach actually does pay off, because there were, for example, one young Vietnamese Chinese girl I'm thinking of in particular here, who in the artwork produced a box. We asked them to make a box which actually told a story about starting off from somewhere that was familiar and going out into somewhere that was less familiar, so as a kind of tell a story about a kind of adventure, and when we were interested in actually what they did with that idea. And this particular girl told a story which started off in her bedroom, as a lot of them did, and then went out into a very, very kind of threatening, paranoid space. She was being pursued by these kind of eyes that were everywhere, and ending up, I think, in a toilet and disappearing down the loo. It was a really kind of a real kind of nightmare scenario, a descent into kind of phobic space. Now, this particular girl, if you kind of saw her in the classroom or even in participating in groups, she would seem to be relatively present, not particularly withdrawn, for example. Contributing, a certain amount, whatever, and not having a particularly kind of, if you like, high profile in talk around issues of safety and danger. It wasn't something that you would pick up that she was actually one of the kind of more voluble spokesmen. We had other people who were very voluble on giving stories of particular encounters or whatever, but she wasn't one of those. So from that evidence, you wouldn't have thought that these issues had much importance or significance for her. And yet through the artwork had this very open-ended agenda. It simply said, you start from somewhere familiar and you go out from it. It didn't say you've got to make a story about race, or you've got to make a story even about this area. It was a very kind of open-ended agenda, and yet within that frame she produced this particular kind of story.
So one of your ways of, as it were, justifying your view of the intensity of these questions for these young kids is through what they tell you in their artwork, which you're holding to be a kind of representation of something which is really important to them. Now, somebody sceptical might say that, how do you know that what people do in a free, imaginative kind of play space is really significant? I mean, it's plainly part of their imagination, but maybe it's just, people do all sorts of things. They go and see films and they have fantasies and so on, but their lives are lived sometimes untroubled by all of that. How do you tell the difference between someone whose extreme manifestations in the form of artwork signify that they are in some difficulties with the pressure of the feelings that they have, and people who simply have fantasies that are nicely placed in those boxes or, on the piece of paper?
Well, one of the things we did in both comparing what they did with this artwork exercise, so we obviously compare the 20 different boxes in terms of the kinds of stories that were told. And then we would then correlate those boxes, a particular young person's box, with the other material they produced through the interviews, through the photo stories and all the rest of it. Well, if you take this particular Vietnamese Chinese girl who produced this very kind of dramatic kind of box with all these kind of staring eyes and clearly all of that, with her accounts of her everyday life in living in the Isle of Dogs, and where she went after school, and where she went at weekends, what you saw was a kind of level of overlap. In other words, you could see from her, if you like, kind of grounded account of what happened to her in her everyday life, some sort of threads that she kind of used and, in a sense, elaborated on in her artwork. But also there were significant differences. And what was interesting about her account of kind of like race relations, peer group relations in the area, was that she immediately indexed that not to something that happened to her, but that happened to somebody else. And she told a story which was actually quite a story of a kind of violent attack on a friend of hers by a drunk. Now this occurred, and I take this as an account of something that actually occurred, in a pub opposite the flats where she lived. Now, when she came to draw her map, because we asked them to draw maps and to kind of indicate on the maps where they went and where their friends lived and where their family, you know, other members of their family might have lived in the area or so on, and areas they avoided and so on. When she came to draw her map, it was interesting that the actual park next to her flat, she thought was actually a reasonably okay place to be at certain times of the day, and obviously not at night, but during the day it was a place where you could meet up with friends. But the pub was definitely a no-go area at any time of the day or night, even, according to this account, when it was closed. And when the pub was open, the park became dangerous. Now, that's clearly relating to something, an experience, right, of living there. It's a very specific account of safety and danger, because just down the road is a kind of more safer place. So it kind of breaks with the dominant account, which says that that whole estate is a kind of, you know, a racial maelstrom. It's, you know, it's not. I mean, that actually it's much more differentiated. So it brings up a clearer picture, I think, of that. And it does also allow us to see, I think, that some of her real social experience of that area is picked up and reworked in a kind of fantasy dimension in a way that connects up with a more unconscious dimension of her experience that would obviously have to be interpreted within a rather different kind of frame, maybe within a psychoanalytical frame, in terms of certain kinds of issues she's working through as an adolescent girl growing up in a Vietnamese Chinese family. Now, you could say the problem was we didn't have the resources or even the terms of reference to kind of follow that through, to see, you know, why that particular kind of social experience, what its actual direct relationship was to this very dramatic kind of paranoid landscape that she'd drawn in her artwork.
Well, but you have often an explanation, which is that here is a girl who, for the most part, is, you know, finds the whole set-up environment okay, but she's just had a rather traumatic experience. If a friend of hers has just been someone she knows has been beaten up, that would affect a person in lots of ways, and it might be an argument for saying that it's a rather particular biographical experience that's upset her, and that what she says for the rest is the way she is for the rest, you know. So there's lots of different ways of interpreting.
There are, except that in her in the guided fantasy, this was another exercise where we gave them starter stories, and we started the stories in a particular environment. It was one down by the river, then was in a nature reserve, and then from that starting point they then take the story where they want it. And in her guided fantasy story, what was interesting was that she set it down by the river, by the Isle of Dogs, and she provided a story which, in a sense, put back everything that had been left out of the artwork. In other words, the story was about this wonderful surprise that happened to her, and it turned out that actually it was her father who was this diver. The story featured this kind of diving suit, right? And when the helmet was taken off, it was her dad with presents, and it was a birthday story, right? Now you could say, well, if she's got this kind of very sort of positive kind of notion of her father as actually somebody who kind of, you know, arrives, makes everything better, turns what could potentially be a threatening situation into a kind of joyous occasion, where was that father in the artwork story? You know, there's nobody that appears in that story to interrupt her descent into this kind of very phobic space. Now that relates to a much wider set of issues around the role of fathers and adult figures more generally in this community, in the Isle of Dogs, and it certainly also arose in a different context in Deptford, but particularly in the Isle of Dogs. One of the things that came through most strongly was the way the police were being positioned and characterised as quasi-parental figures. Now, you're talking about young people who, in many of their kind of accounts they gave, were extremely hostile to the police, that portrayed the police as being extremely hostile to them, and yet in some of the narratives they made up in completing the guided fantasy exercise, the police appeared in roles as custodians of community history, people who would come and basically explain the rationale of what had been going on. In other words, filling, in a sense, a kind of a gap that had come into existence in this ex-Dockland community where men and fathers no longer play such a kind of functional role, right? Now, what I'm trying to say there is that what you're doing is using these different kinds of evidences and linking them to other sets of information around the social history of the area and how it's changed in terms of the closure of the docks and all of that. So that is how I would respond, I think, to that, to say that one is actually placing one set of evidences against another, and trying to look at the...
Yes. Well, there are very different kinds of evidences, and I do think there's a whole set of questions about how you infer unconscious states of mind and then family patterns from the kind of evidence that you have. You're using methods that are not very far from psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic interpretations, but in settings which are in other respects rather unlike psychoanalytic sessions. So I think people might be a little sceptical and might want some convincing that that's being done justifiably. I mean, I certainly think the example of the policeman and the role of the police in people's imagination is an interesting case. You explain it as a substitute for absent fathers in a community. Question, what evidence is there that it is that? But there is another interpretation one could offer, which is that here are people who, in the end, have quite good internal parents. That's to say they retain a sense that the world is, after all, orderly. And the police are, indeed, the social embodiment of ultimate order. So the conjuring of the police as people who will solve problems when problems have to be solved is not so much a sign of a deficit, but a sign of an underlying, structural security, which, having seen these young kids on your video walkabout, seems to me to be not completely, unbelievable. The question is, how does one know one's doing it well? How does one know that one's, doing good interpretive work rather than wild interpretive work, dealing with this kind of material?
Well, I think, first of all, one would start from a general kind of set of propositions about the way the sociological imagination works, or the social imaginary works. And I think a lot of people would argue that what you might regard as primary process thinking, or the kinds of fantasy constructs that have, in another context, been interpreted within a psychological frame, actually do apply within the way in which people imagine social relations and the way in which the social itself is imagined. So I don't see a kind of a necessary kind of disjuncture there in terms of applying that kind of way of interpreting images and text, actually. But if the question then is, well, how do you know, for example, if somebody is simply quoting a piece of film that they've seen, or like obviously in a project that's looking at notions of landscape and safety and danger, you can imagine that young people would draw on quite a wide repertoire of films, television programs, as well as local gossip, rumour and so on. Indeed, one of the whole dimensions of the project was to look at what were the sources of the citation. Right? So, for example, we had one piece of artwork which this girl did, which was a classic piece of kind of Gothic horror. It was all kind of purple and crosses and stakes through the heart and blood and so on. It was a very clear kind of reproduction, really, of a kind of Gothic horror story. Now, if we said that we then compared that with other material that this girl had produced, it seemed to us that from other things she'd said, from our observation of her and working in the peer groups and the video walkabouts, that she had a very kind of grounded sense of who she was, where she belonged, the boundaries of kind of self and other, and the community. Now that could become quite racialized in her case, right? And who belonged and who didn't. it could get quite specific in terms of, well, I'm sitting on this landing on our estate with my friends, and this is our territory, and we're actually quite glad that the boys are out there protecting us from incursions from Asian gangs and so on. So it could get read in that way. But she nevertheless had that sense of, if you like, ontological security about it, however racialized it was. Now, to then say, well, then she produced this kind of very kind of like over-the-top Gothic horror kind of thing, I think then relates to a theory, well, if you have that kind of security, you can play with it, right? And in a sense, you can use the plastic elements of the exercise, the paint and the objects and so on, to have fun with, to play with the horror. And that's, in a sense, an argument of what horror stories are about. But those that didn't have maybe that kind of sense of security, and for reasons that one could only speculate about in terms of a project within these frameworks, it might have had something to do with a purely interior kind of situation, or it might have had something to do or impacted on a social experience that had occurred to them. And I mean, frankly, in a project like this, there were many situations like that where it was not possible for us to determine accurately, how much was being drawn from some kind of quite kind of psychic kind of drama, and how much was a translation of some kind of social drama that was being played out in the area. The two were very impacted, but it was often difficult to tell what was coming from where.
Well, I don't have any problem in principle in the idea that these different levels of reality impact on one another and can be, need to be thought about. I mean, I suppose I agree with what you said at the end. That in fact, it must be quite difficult to tell how far material you're looking at is the result of individual states of mind and experiences, and how far it's the result of the social. But I guess that's the problem of your project, to try to make some sense of those distinctions. The other major topic that we should come back to, which is one of the things you started with, which is the fact that the methods that you chose to use were intended to enable the kids to take an active part in this process, and not simply be, as you put it, sort of research fodder. And I suppose I want to ask you the question as to how far do you think that worked, and what you think the kids actually got out of the experience of, engaging in all these exercises. And then we can talk about how this relates to the research process itself. But tell me what it was like for the kids in the project.
Well, I think they would have different experiences to recount on that. I think in the closure interviews, when they did kind of review and evaluate the kind of experience, some of them clearly had found it useful, had found it interesting, had found for some it was a way of skiving off schoolwork, for some it was doing something more interesting than they did normally in social studies. They all got a certificate of achievement for taking part, so they had that kind of put in their portfolios. I think for some of them it gave them an opportunity to explore issues that they hadn't, in a way that they hadn't been able to do before. There was this exchange visit with the young people from Hamburg who'd been involved in a similar project, and I think some of them found that very interesting and also somewhat challenging. And we went to considerable lengths really to try and keep them informed. The two groups from Deptford and Our Dogs met up. We had a number of kind of activities that involved them. We had a report back session where we came back to them and said, look, this is the story we're telling about the research. This is a summary of the findings that we're going with. What do you think of it? And that was very interesting in terms of what they picked up on as what had been important for them and what they thought was important to us. So it began a sort of dialogue, if you like, between what social scientists find interesting and what the young people themselves thought were important.
It is consistent with your view of what helps that there should be spaces like this in which these questions can be reflected on. You describe the Isle of Dogs school as basically repressive and not helping by being repressive, what you're allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say. So it does look as if an experience where kids have all kinds of different ways of thinking about these questions is likely to be a bit liberating and loosening up for everybody. And the video walkabout film I've seen suggests that might have been happening. I suppose the other question, though, is that how one would measure that, or as part of the research process, to see whether this kind of activity, or parts of this kind of activity, ought to be the kinds of things that are going on in schools generally. And it seems to me that's the action research part of the project, as opposed to the, so to speak, normal, conventional, objective research part of the project, which it seems to me is a separate dimension of what you've been trying to do.
Well, I think it's important to stress that this was very much a kind of experimental project. We were trying a number of different methods that hadn't quite been put together in this way before, so that in that sense it was a pilot for a kind of an approach to doing this kind of research around this kind of area with those kinds of informants. And I think we learned an awful lot about what the limits and conditions are of that particular kind of research practice. We deliberately tried to make some of the methods continuous with the kinds of educational work that might be done in schools. So that, for example, the artwork was actually done as part of a kind of national curriculum art syllabus. Some of the methods around using photography could similarly have been used in a kind of educational setting. And I think one of the things that's coming out of this is going to be a kind of youth interactive video, and then a training pack around that, in which we actually do feedback some of what in another context are research findings, but use that as a kind of basis for a series of kind of trigger questions for classroom discussion, for youth work projects, community arts projects and the like. Now that means that there is a sort of kind of other kind of fuzzy sort of area, if you like, between actually what is kind of bona fide social research, or research in the field of cultural geography in this case, and what is pedagogy and what is kind of educational practice. I mean, I have to say that I've always found, I've used photography, for example, a lot as a research device, simply because I find that actually young people taking photographs act as about, in this case, areas that were safe or danger or interesting to them or whatever, was a terrific trigger for eliciting stories. And with these young people, if we'd simply asked them to tell us a story about X or Y or Z, I think we would have got nowhere. But there was something about the process where they, in a sense, put themselves in the picture. They went out with these cameras, these disposable cameras, took the photographs, came back, and then told stories around these pictures. There was something about that process that opened up an area of narrativity, which I don't think we'd have got to any other way. How you then analyse those narratives and how you relate those narratives to other sociological evidence, I think is a very important question which you raised all the way through, and I think certainly that we need to actually address more closely.